Over the past 3 years, we've covered some perplexing mysteries on the Seriously Mysterious podcast, featuring research and writing by several great true crime advocates. Now, we're bringing you video versions of some of the most challenging and interesting cases from that show. If you're already a fan of the podcast, these versions are also going to include news and updates to make sure that you know all of the latest on these cases. Welcome to the best of Seriously Mysterious. For as long as there have been teenagers, there have been instances of teenagers running away from home. Whether it's a less than desirable home life, a mounting feeling of pressure and heightened expectations, or simply the promise of a thrilling adventure, there are many reasons why a teen would want to distance themselves from their home environment and venture off into the big open world. Perhaps this is why the runaway conclusion is what law enforcement initially tends to gravitate towards when a teenager is reported missing, although this may not always be a fair assessment. In the early 1980s, teenage rebellion certainly wasn't an unusual thing, but when a girl with dreams of becoming a member of law enforcement disappeared from her small Oregon town, the typical runaway conclusion wasn't much of an option. Now, nearly 40 years after her disappearance, the question still remains: why was this girl's bright future cut short before she had even graduated high school? I'm John Lordan, and in this episode, we're delving into the seriously mysterious disappearance of Joan Leigh Hall from Warrenton, Oregon, a case that her sister would later call Oregon's dirty little secret. Warrenton, Oregon is a small coastal town in the northwest part of Oregon with a population of just under 5,000 people as of the 2010 census. Back in the 1980s, its population was essentially half of that, with the census accounting for less than 2,500 residents. Being such a small, close-knit community has its advantages, but in the case of Joan Hall, this factor could have played a part in why her disappearance has remained unsolved for nearly 40 years. Joan Leigh Hall was, by all accounts, a pretty remarkable girl. The slender, 5 feet 5 inch tall brunette was the youngest of 6 children, and she seemed to possess a maturity that was well beyond that of a typical 17-year-old. According to friends and family, Joan, called Joni by those close to her, had a particularly strong moral compass and was known to speak out when she saw anything that seemed wrong occurring. She was heavily involved with the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department Explorer Post, an organization designed to encourage local youths to follow their interest in law enforcement or other related career fields. In fact, the day before Joni disappeared, she'd received the honor of becoming the first female president of her local Explorer Post chapter. Joni had a bright future, a future that was seemingly cut short nearly 40 years ago on September 30th, 1983. The initial police report begins at the Warrenton High School football game that night when Joan's brother Chuck Hall approached Police Chief William Humphrey with an unnamed friend at around 8:15 p.m. He informed the chief that Joan had never made it home after school, and he was concerned. Chief Humphrey immediately began looking around the game for any sign of Joan, under the assumption that she may not have gone home after school but was still at the event. After learning from a few other students that Joan wasn't at the game, he then discovered that after school, Joan was usually given a ride to her tutoring job at the local elementary school by a student named Mike Moore. Chief Humphrey located Moore in the grandstand section of the audience, and when he spoke with him, Moore confirmed that he had given Joan a ride from the school that afternoon, but added that he had dropped her off at the local mini-mart so she could get a soda, and he had no idea where Joan had gone after that. The chief returned to Chuck Hall to tell him what he had learned, and Chuck left to continue looking for his sister. Later that evening, at around 11 p.m., Joan's mother formally reported her missing to Deputy Gerald Bosch, who then informed Chief Humphrey that it was unusual for Joan to disappear, especially under those circumstances and without a trace. Although this statement wasn't elaborated upon in Humphrey's report, it could be reasonably inferred that Bosch was either familiar with Joan due to her involvement with the Explorer's Post, or that this was something that her mother might have said when she was calling it in. The report that was written by Bosch reads, quote, Mrs. Hall explained that her daughter is extremely reliable and always calls home when she's going to be late, etc. Mrs. Hall further stated that she has never had a problem with Joan, and there were no family problems now. Also, Joan doesn't smoke or drink. Over the following weekend, some movement was made by investigators regarding Joan's disappearance. In Chief Humphrey's report, it was mentioned that he was told by Deputy Bosch that they were still attempting to locate her and that although he had spoken with several other young people, nobody had seen or heard from Joan since the 30th of September. Bosch's report mentions going door to door and canvassing areas around the mini-mart, the high school, and the elementary school in the hopes of locating Joan. On October 4th, 5 days after Joan had disappeared, the Warrenton Police Department officially held their first meeting about the case. At this meeting, it was confirmed that she was still missing, and Chief Humphrey and another officer quickly headed over to the last place where Joan was seen, the Warrenton Mini-Mart. They spoke with Kathy Russell, the manager of the store, who informed them that she was not the person who waited on Joan, but that she had seen her in the store on the day that she disappeared. She believed that Joan had bought a Coke and had headed west on foot in the direction of the elementary school. After doing what they could at the mini-mart, the detectives headed over to Warrenton High School, where they spoke with a friend of Mike Moore's named Mike Davis. Davis told them that he had also been at the mini-mart on that day, and that he had witnessed Joan get out of Moore's car and go into the store. He said that he had spoken briefly to Moore outside of the store, gone inside to buy something, and by the time he left, Joan and Mike Moore were nowhere to be seen. Detectives spoke with a few more classmates and associates of Joan's, some of them former runaways, and they all either said that they didn't know her well or that they knew her well enough to know that she wasn't streetwise or impulsive enough to consider running away like they had. Chief Humphrey then located Mike Moore again, asking him to retrace his steps when it came to the day that he dropped Joan off at the mini-mart. He stated that Mike Davis had in fact arrived at the mini-mart around the same time when he had with Joan, and that while Joan went inside, he approached Davis's car and talked to Davis for a while. According to him, Joan came out of the mini-mart with her soda and approached him and Davis at Davis's car. When the boys asked if she wanted a ride, she declined the offer for some reason. He then said that Joan left on foot, headed west. It's fairly obvious that there are a few discrepancies and similarities in all of the statements that have been discussed so far. Detectives went door to door along the route between the mini-mart and the elementary school, down East Harbor Street and Southwest Cedar Avenue, trying to locate anybody who could have seen Joan on that afternoon. But their efforts yielded very little in the way of solid leads. A couple of people said that they may have seen her walking, but weren't completely sure that the girl they had seen was in fact Joan. They went to the harbor to see if there were any boats that Joan could have been on, the airport to check and see if she may have gotten onto a plane, and nothing panned out. It seemed like Joan Hall had simply vanished into thin air. The next day, on October 5th, a student contacted police at the local high school after hearing a rumor that detectives had located Joan at the airport. The detectives spoke with this student for a while, who confirmed what they already knew about Joan. She was a girl with high moral character who didn't get into trouble. After this conversation, detectives used the high school's PA system to broadcast an announcement. They wanted to hear from anybody who had any information about Joan. It didn't take long for people to start coming forward. Namely, 3 young men named Jimmy Sears, Gary Lear, and Mike Bosch. You heard that correctly. Mike Bosch, who happened to be the son of one of the officers handling the investigation, Deputy Gerald Bosch. Each boy gave a statement to police. Jimmy Sears was first, and he said that he and the other 2 boys had gone to get something to eat after school and that they had driven around for a while before heading back to his house. Shortly thereafter, Mike Moore pulled up with Joan in the passenger seat of his vehicle. The boys spoke for a bit. Sears claimed that Moore was picking up the rear end for a vehicle from the junkyard and planned to drop it off with a friend of theirs named Jay Hitchman. Sears also said that before Moore left, he had mentioned that he planned to drop Joan off at the mini-mart. When the officer contacted Hitchman, he learned that Hitchman had indeed found a vehicle's rear end in his driveway covered with a raincoat around 4 p.m. on September 30th. Gary Lear backed up some of Jimmy Sears' statement, but he elaborated on a few things. For one, he said that it was around 4 p.m. that he saw Mike Moore at Sears' house and that his hands were greasy. He said that Moore had a girl in the passenger seat of his car who he believed was Joan, and that he said he was taking her home and then planned on working on his car, having already retrieved the necessary part from the wrecking yard. Mike Bosch also confirmed that Moore had arrived at Sears' home at around 4 p.m. and that his hands were greasy and that Joan was in his car. And that is where the official police report, at least the part available to the public, ends. But that is mostly just the report that was taken by Chief Humphrey. Deputy Gerald Bosch's report, on the other hand, provides a few new insights and raises a few more questions regarding Joan's disappearance. For example, in Bosch's report, there's mention of a student seeing Joan at the Warrenton High School football game, even going so far as to say that this particular student said hello to her, and that she was sitting next to a girl with long, dark hair who the student did not know. This sighting of Joan isn't fully confirmed and is literally the only alleged sighting of her that takes place after she leaves the mini-mart. There was also a statement given by a woman named Tammy Creets. Creets claimed to have seen Joan getting into a yellow four-door Datsun or Toyota that was supposedly driven by a gentleman who had dropped out of Warrenton High School a few years prior. But that statement was later retracted. Why Creets retracted her statement is not mentioned in the report. Then there is perhaps the most baffling part of this investigation, Gerald Bosch's notes regarding interviewing his own son, Michael Bosch, and his son's friends, Jimmy Sears and Gary Lear. Although all three boys initially stated that it had been Joan in the passenger side of Mike Moore's vehicle, they all quickly switched their stories to claim that another girl by the name of Teresa Woods was in the car that day. In this portion of Bosch's notes, there is an arrow pointing to this correction and one word: why? Why indeed? Why would these boys all change their stories within a matter of days? And why would the Warrenton Police Department allow one of their detectives to be involved in interviewing his own son? That's the question that was asked a bit more formally in 2010 when Tom Jensen of KATU News wrote one of the few news articles about Joan's disappearance at the request of Joan's late sister, Charlotte. "Somebody knows something," Charlotte is quoted as saying. "There's a dirty little secret in that town that somebody knows, and I'm sure there's more than one person that knows that," she concludes. Unfortunately, Charlotte passed away 2 weeks before the article was published. Joan's best friend, Maggie Perry, provided the news station with photographs of Joan and a photograph of Teresa Woods. These photos are still out there on the internet after all these years, thanks to advocates who will not allow Joan's case to be forgotten about. In these photos, it's abundantly clear that Teresa and Joan were two very different-looking young women. Joan was a slim girl with a long face, large blue eyes, and curly light brown hair that gained blonde highlights in the sun. Teresa Woods seemed to be a little bit heavier than Joan, with a rounder face, dark eyes, and dark hair. Unfortunately, we'll probably never know whether it was Joan or Teresa in Mike Moore's car on that afternoon, as Teresa was sadly murdered in an unrelated incident in Minnesota in 1995. For what it's worth, though, her brother and her best friend still swore as recently as 2010 that Teresa was never with Mike Moore on the day that Joan Hall disappeared. When KATU News made their attempts in 2010 to contact Mike Bosch, Jimmy Sears, Gary Lear, and Mike Moore, they discovered that Bosch had moved to California just days after Joan's disappearance, and that's where he still lived. Over the phone, he told reporters that he had thought it was Joan in Moore's vehicle on that day, but that either Sears or Lear had told him it must have been Teresa Woods. Interestingly enough, Bosch also asked reporters how he could get a hold of Jimmy Sears. Whether or not he actually did contact Sears, remains unknown. When Sears was contacted by reporters in 2010, he simply responded via email saying, "I can't remember anything about that day. It was just too long ago." As for Gary Lear, KATU contacted his wife at the bagel shop they owned in Seaside, Oregon, and she informed them that her husband knew nothing about Joan Hall's disappearance. The reporter left his card, and Lear's wife said that Lear would call him back. He never did. Similarly, when the reporter attempted to contact Mike Moore at his home in Astoria, Moore's wife told him to leave. When the reporter tried to follow up with Mike Moore via telephone, a Clatsop County deputy called him and informed him that the Moores were threatening to file a telephonic harassment complaint charge against him for phoning their home. Josh Markey, who was the Clatsop District Attorney back in 2010, told reporters that as far as Deputy Gerald Bosch's involvement in the investigation was concerned, quote, "You should never have police officers who are related to witnesses or people of interest engaging in interviews." He also added that the questions that were not asked, the case is pregnant with those. Adding to the general confusion of this case, Tammy Creets, who mentioned seeing Joan get into a yellow car outside of the mini-mart with an older male driver, told KATU by phone that Gerald Bosch had bullied her into changing her story. Another woman who claimed to have witnessed Joan getting into a yellow car looking confused and scared made a similar statement saying that she changed her story when she was interviewed by Gerald Bosch. Not surprisingly, when KATU attempted to reach out to Gerald Bosch, he did not return their calls. So what happened to Joan Hall on the afternoon of September 30th, 1983? There are still several theories, some that hold more weight than others, and each one comes with its own unique concerns and characters. There is, of course, the possibility that Joan had run away, but how much stock can we really put into that theory when pretty much everybody who knew her mentioned how reliable and honest she was? She had no problems with her family that anybody was aware of. She got good grades and was making plans for her future. What sense would it make for Joan to interrupt these plans on her own? Could Joan have had an older boyfriend or somebody that she would have voluntarily left town with? Again, given what we know of Joan's personality, that doesn't seem very likely either. The only thing we have that would really point in that direction is the statement that was made and later retracted by Tammy Creets. Even then, the identity of the person who was driving this yellow car that she allegedly saw remains a mystery. There is also the possibility of foul play, and this theory takes several different forms. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, there were quite a few active serial killers taking young women on the West Coast, most notably Gary Ridgway and Ted Bundy. Although Joan doesn't necessarily fit the profiles of their victims entirely, and two of Ridgway's unidentified victims have been ruled out by NamUs as being Joan, this seems at least a little more likely than Joan leaving of her own volition. Then there's Joan's recent election as president of the Clatsop County Sheriff's Explorer post. While this may not seem like a huge deal now, Joan was the first female to hold this position of authority in the club. And, as one might wonder, did whoever she run against happen to hold a grudge? Could some young man have been so upset about being beaten in an election by a woman that he decided to intimidate and possibly even hurt Joan? Is this one of those unanswered questions that the DA mentioned, this case being so full of? Another theory that made the rounds within the online sleuthing communities is whether or not Joan, being the upstanding young citizen that she was, could have stumbled upon something illegal around the time of her disappearance. Although there's no firm evidence to back this theory up, given what her classmates had to say about Joan's personality, it's not impossible to envision her strong moral compass leading her to do something rash in the pursuit of justice. Then there is the matter of the teenage boys entangled within this story. Mike Moore, Mike Davis, Mike Bosch, Jimmy Sears, and Gary Lear. Could these men be hiding a huge secret? Did something happen to Joan on that afternoon that they simply refused to talk about? Between the differences in Moore and Davis's statements about what happened at the mini-mart and the other three boys giving one statement only to quickly retract it, claiming to have mistaken Joan for another girl who looked nothing like her, this is a hard possibility to not give strong consideration to. Did Michael Bosch's father overstep his bounds within the investigation? Did he, in fact, bully any of the witnesses that he interviewed, as was claimed by some of them in the KATU article? Even if that didn't happen, even if Gerald Bosch did everything to the absolute letter of the law, the question remains, why did the Warrenton Police Department keep him on this case when his son was a witness at one point? Small towns can typically be understaffed as far as law enforcement goes. But even if that were the case, wasn't there some kind of procedure that they would be required to follow to avoid a possible conflict of interest down the line? If Joan or her remains were ever located and a suspect named, couldn't this have harmed the prosecution? It certainly seems that something of this nature is being protected. An open letter to Clatsop District Attorney Ron Brown and the Sheriff's Office was published in May of 2021 by the Cannon Beach Gazette, and it contained a very disturbing detail. The letter, written by a self-described small but dedicated group of civilians, states that the case has been egregiously mishandled from the very beginning, and that when the group attempted to file a Freedom of Information Act request for any available records from the case, they learned that on December 10th, 2018, Judge Paula Brownfield signed a protective order, keeping the investigative files on Joni's case sealed from the public eye for the next 75 years. The victim's family wasn't notified of this, and that means that all records related to Joan Leigh Hall will be unsealed 110 years after the date of her disappearance. Why would this happen? This isn't the JFK assassination. I don't understand this. Does this point to the nickname that Joni's sister gave this case so many years ago potentially being true? Is she really Oregon's dirty little secret? There's another consideration with this. In a response directly from a detective in the sheriff's office about her records being sealed, he stated, quote, "The Hall case and all associated cases held by assisting agencies was sealed." Is Joan Hall's case connected to other unsolved crimes? Or is he just referring to reports from other agencies that assisted in the search for her? If this case is tied to more crimes, why has law enforcement never informed the local community or her family about that? Luckily, there are still people out there who want to see Joni come home to her loved ones, no matter what the case may be. Dina Rush, one of those civilians dedicated to advancing this case, has been advocating for Joan on her sister Charlotte's behalf for over a decade now, collecting information in the hopes that someday something leads to Joan. Quote, "It was one of Charlotte Hall Packard's biggest dreams that her little sister Joni be found and buried next to her parents at Ocean View Cemetery in Warrenton." Dina told that to the Daily Historian in one of their more recent news articles about Joan. Back in 2010, when Charlotte passed away, her son purchased a double plot for her next to her parents. So now, whenever Joni is found, she can be laid to rest next to the sister who never stopped looking for her. As of September 2023, very few new updates are happening around this case. Joni is still featured on the cold cases page of the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office and appears in a recent list of Oregon's cases that have baffled the authorities. It seems that all we can do right now is keep talking about Joan Leigh Hall and hoping that someone that has information on this case will call it in to the Clatsop County Sheriff's Department at 503-325-8635. Do you have any insights or even a case you'd like to suggest? Feel free to send it to me. You'll find a comment form and case submission link at LordanArts.com. A huge thank you to Dina Maddox Rush for the tireless advocacy work that she has done and continues to do for Joan's case, as well as her small but dedicated team including Jason Futch and our researcher and writer on today's case, Gwen Berenger. Thank you for learning more about Joni's story. And please join us again in 2 weeks with another case that I know you'll find seriously mysterious.